My name is Margaret Hayes, though that night it felt like everyone in the ballroom only knew me as Dan's mom. I was seated near the kitchen doors, close enough to feel the heat each time a server pushed through with a tray of plated salmon or sparkling wine. The head table glowed beneath the chandeliers. My son, Daniel, straight-backed in his tux, beside his new wife, Olivia. Both of them lit up like they belonged on a magazine cover. I kept telling myself to be proud, to focus on their happiness, but my stomach twisted when I saw the empty chair at the head table where a mother usually sits. That honor had gone to Olivia's parents, Patricia and Gerald, smiling like royalty greeting their subjects. I pressed the napkin into my lap, trying to ignore the ache settling in my chest. I had worked double shifts for most of my life. I had buried a husband and raised a boy alone, yet there I was, tucked beside a stack of spare chairs, while toasts and laughter filled the room like warm sunlight I couldn't quite step into. The MC tapped the microphone, calling for attention. Olivia rose gracefully, turning toward the room with the ease of someone used to applause. When her gaze settled on me, I straightened, hoping she might recognize me as more than a side character in her perfect night. "I want to say something about Margaret," she began. A hush fell. Forks paused mid-air. I felt 100 eyes slide toward me. "Margaret lives out on a little farm all by herself," Olivia said, her voice soft and sweet, like she was describing a stray she'd found behind a grocery store. "And Dan and I decided she deserves more support. That's why we've arranged for her to move into my old condo in the city. She won't have to be isolated anymore." Applause swelled. My heart dropped. Then Daniel stood, flushed with excitement, and lifted the mic. "And while we were getting ready today," he said, "Olivia's parents and her sister moved into Mom's farmhouse. They've already started settling in." The applause died instantly. Heat surged behind my eyes. I pushed my chair back, rising slowly, refusing to let my voice shake. "Daniel," I said, "is there something you forgot to ask me first?" The ballroom fell silent as I turned, walked out, and let the door close behind me, knowing I had to see what was left of my home before anyone else claimed another piece of it. The night air outside the hotel felt colder than it should have for early summer. I walked to my car with my heels clicking against the pavement like a metronome marking the seconds between the woman I had just been humiliated as and the woman I needed to become. By the time I pulled onto the highway, the city lights were shrinking in my rearview mirror, and the ache in my chest had settled into something sharper, steadier. I wasn't driving home out of spite. I was driving home because I had to know whether my son's words were just a drunken exaggeration or the truth he hadn't had the courage to tell me sober. The road to the farmhouse is long and dark, lined with fields that stretch out like open palms. When I first moved out there, I used to talk to the cornfields as if someone were listening. I'd come home from the factory too exhausted to stand, but I'd sit on the front step, still in my work boots, breathing in that quiet like it was something holy. Back then, everything I owned fit inside a single pickup truck. The farmhouse wasn't pretty. It wasn't even in good condition, but it was mine, earned through every double shift I had taken after Tom died. Tom didn't leave much behind when he passed. A stack of medical bills, a few tools, a wedding band I kept on a chain, and a little boy who slept curled beside me during storms because he was afraid the roof would blow off. Daniel was 8 then, all elbows and stubborn pride, with a smile that could erase a week's worth of fatigue. I promised him we'd have a place where he could run without worrying about traffic or neighbors complaining about noise. I promised him a home with space to breathe. It took me nearly 20 years to save enough for a down payment. I packed lunches instead of buying them, patched old coats instead of replacing them, and worked every weekend I wasn't too tired to stand. When I signed the deed to the farmhouse, My hands shook so badly the pen left a tiny streak of ink across the page. Daniel was in college then, proud of me, but embarrassed by how far the farm was from the city. He helped me move the heavy furniture, kissed my forehead, and drove away with the windows down and the music loud. I stayed on the porch until his taillights disappeared, holding a mug of coffee that had already gone cold. The years after that were quieter than I expected. I grew tomatoes, baked bread for farmers' markets, and tended to the apple trees even when the frost threatened to kill them. Sometimes Daniel would come home for a weekend, bringing laundry and stories about office politics. Other times he'd cancel at the last minute because Olivia's family had invited him to brunch or to a fundraiser or to something that required dress shoes and a tie. I understood. Young people gravitate toward noise and lights. They don't know yet how precious silence can be. I met the Sterlings 2 years after Daniel started dating Olivia. Their house looked like the kind of place where no one ever sat on the good furniture. Patricia greeted me at the door with a smile so polished it almost reflected the chandelier above us. She asked about my drive, about the weather out near the farm, about whether life out there was safe for an older woman. I told her I managed just fine, but she kept pressing, as if the idea of a woman living alone in the countryside was a personal affront to her sense of order. During dinner, Gerald coughed into a cloth napkin, his pale face betraying the strain of his heart condition. Chloe asked Daniel if she could visit the farm sometime, not out of interest in me, but because she wanted to get away from the city rent for a few days. Olivia laughed and said something about fresh air being good for her father's lungs. They all looked at me then, expectant, like the solution to their problems was sitting on a plate between the mashed potatoes and the roast chicken. I realized that night that they weren't admiring the farmhouse I'd worked half my life to buy. They were circling it. Their questions grew bolder with each visit. Patricia asked whether the mortgage was fully paid off. Gerald wondered aloud if the extra bedrooms stayed unused. Olivia teased Daniel about hosting family retreats there, planting the idea that the farm was somehow communal now that he was marrying into their world. I should have pushed back harder. I should have recognized the shift in Daniel's voice when he talked about the place, not as the home that raised him, but as an asset. He started referring to it as Mom's property, not Mom's home. And there was a distance in those words, a kind of blind practicality that felt foreign to the boy I had raised. One evening, just a month before the wedding, he drove out to see me. He stood on the porch, hands shoved into his pockets, the sunset throwing long shadows across the fields. He told me the Sterlings were struggling, that Gerald's treatments were expensive, that Chloe was on the verge of losing her apartment. He said it softly, like he was confessing something heavy. Then he asked for the spare keys. He said a plumber needed to check the pipes before the weather changed. He said he didn't want to bother me with an early morning appointment. He said all the right things, and I believed him because I had always believed him. I handed over the keys, not realizing I had just opened the door to a future where my son saw my life as flexible, negotiable, available for redistribution. The farmhouse lights shimmered faintly in the distance as I turned onto my gravel road. Whatever waited behind that door, I knew the truth would change something permanent inside me, and I was right. Oh, the gravel crunched under my tires as I pulled closer to the house. From a distance, the farmhouse looked the same as always. Dark roofline, wide porch, a single porch swing that creaked whenever the wind pushed through. But as I reached the driveway, my headlights hit an unfamiliar SUV parked crookedly near the steps. A second car was half hidden behind the oak tree. My heart tightened. Daniel hadn't been exaggerating. They were here. Every window glowed as if the place were hosting a holiday gathering I hadn't been invited to. I sat in the car for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel, listening to the engine idle. I didn't know what waited for me inside, anger, confusion, or some polite version of entitlement dressed up as gratitude. All I knew was that my home, the place that had carried me through grief and loneliness and every quiet morning of the last decade, was no longer empty. When I stepped onto the porch, I noticed the door wasn't fully closed. A suitcase blocked part of the entryway. The welcome mat had been shifted sideways, tracked with dirt that wasn't mine. I pushed the door open and stopped in the doorway, stunned. The living room lights were on. Coats hung on the hooks beside the door, coats I didn't recognize. My Afghan blanket had been pushed aside on the couch to make room for a stack of folded sweaters. The scent of brewed chamomile drifted from the kitchen. Patricia appeared first, wearing a soft cardigan and holding a mug with both hands like she belonged there. Her expression barely flickered when she saw me. Instead of guilt, she offered a tired smile. "Oh, Margaret, you're back early. We didn't want to disturb you during the reception. Gerald needed to lie down. Poor thing. The drive was too much for him." Behind her, Gerald rested on my couch with his shoes off, covered with one of my quilts. His breathing was shallow, but he lifted a hand weakly in greeting. Chloe sat at the dining table with her laptop open, earbuds dangling around her neck, typing as if this were her dorm room. I stepped farther in, closing the door behind me. "Why are you here?" My voice was steady, even though my chest was tight enough to crack. Patricia blinked slowly, as if she couldn't understand the question. "Dan told us you were completely on board with the plan. He said you'd be moving into Olivia's condo soon. We thought it would be easier to begin settling in now rather than wait." "That was never discussed with me," I said. She tilted her head gently, the way someone might correct a confused child. "But Dan explained everything. Your safety, the isolation, the maintenance on this place. We're doing what's best for the whole family." Chloe closed her laptop with a little clap, stretching her arms. "This house is amazing. Mrs. Hayes? I already claimed the upstairs room with the big window. I hope that's okay. The view is incredible." I stared at her. She wasn't being cruel, just oblivious, sheltered by a lifetime of being told the world was already arranged for her comfort. "This is my home," I said. "You can't just move in." Patricia stepped closer, lowering her voice like we were sharing a secret. "We're not trying to take anything from you. We only want everyone to be comfortable. Gerald needs space and quiet. Chloe needs stability. Olivia and Dan want to know you're safe. Surely you can see this is the most compassionate solution." Compassion? That word stabbed deeper than anger. I thought of every winter night I'd sat alone in this house, patching cracks in the walls, paying off medical debts, missing my son during holidays because he'd chosen to spend them with this family. No one had offered me compassion then, and now, when I'd finally built a life I could stand inside without shaking, they wanted to rearrange it to fit their needs. "You need to leave," I said. "Tonight." Chloe scoffed and rolled her eyes. "Seriously?" Patricia's smile thinned. "We've had a long day. Margaret, this isn't the time for dramatics." The word hit me like a slap. I straightened, letting the years of exhaustion and sacrifice fall away until only resolve remained. "You have 48 hours, I said, my voice firm enough to silence even Chloe. 48 hours to pack your things and go. After that, I call the sheriff." Silence spread across the room, heavy and electric. Gerald shifted uncomfortably under the quilt. Chloe's face flushed. Patricia's jaw tightened as she studied me, finally recognizing that I wasn't the quiet, pliable woman they assumed I'd always be. I turned toward the stairs without waiting for their response. At the top, I paused just long enough to hear Patricia whisper sharply, "Well, that was rude." Maybe it was. but it was the first time in a long while that my voice belonged entirely to me. I barely slept that night. I kept hearing footsteps downstairs, muted voices, cabinet doors opening and closing as if my home had become a rental house for passing travelers. At dawn, I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the keys Daniel had taken from me weeks earlier. I kept thinking of his face when I walked out of the wedding, a mixture of confusion and embarrassment, like he suddenly realized the script he'd rehearsed with Olivia's family didn't include a mother who might say no. When the sun finally rose, I drove into town and parked outside Aaron Kaplan's law office. He'd drawn up my deed years ago, a quiet man with gentle eyes and a desk cluttered with more paperwork than seemed manageable. When he saw me in the doorway, he stood quickly, concern softening his features. "Maggie, what's wrong?" I sat across from him and told him everything, the speech, the keys, the Sterlings unpacking in my living room as if they'd been invited. He listened without interrupting, hands folded, breathing slowly. When I finished, he leaned forward and asked to see my deed. After studying it, he nodded with the quiet finality of a man who has handled far too many property disputes. "They have no legal right to be in your home," he said. "You didn't give permission. There's no lease, no agreement, nothing. If they don't leave when you tell them to, you call the sheriff. Do not argue with them. Do not put your hands on anything they've touched. And do not let their emotions sway you." I exhaled shakily, realizing how tight my chest had been. He gave me his card, circled the non-emergency sheriff's number, and reminded me that trespassing didn't become less serious just because the trespassers smiled politely. When I returned to the farm, the Sterlings were already up. Chloe had spread her clothes across the dining chairs. Patricia was rearranging items on my kitchen counter, humming as she wiped down a space I had already cleaned. Gerald shuffled in wearing my late husband's old flannel shirt, the one I kept in the closet because I couldn't bring myself to donate it. Something inside me snapped at the sight of that shirt. Grief and anger collided so hard it felt like a physical blow. This was no longer inconvenience. This was intrusion at the most intimate corners of my life. Patricia greeted me cheerfully, pretending nothing had changed. "We're making breakfast. I hope you like oatmeal. Gerald needs something gentle on his stomach." I didn't respond. I walked past her, opened the cupboard, and took down a mug. My hands didn't shake. "You have until tomorrow morning," I said. "After that, I make the call." Patricia's smile tightened. "You wouldn't do that. Think of Gerald's health." "I am," I said. "He shouldn't be in someone else's house without permission." Chloe muttered something under her breath about ungrateful old people, but I ignored her. The 48 hours crawled by. They didn't pack. They didn't even pretend to. Instead, they acted as though my deadline were an empty threat, a dramatic outburst from a woman they assumed would eventually fold. Daniel called twice, each conversation more painful than the last. He insisted I was overreacting, that I was making things difficult for everyone, that Olivia was in tears and didn't understand why I was being so rigid. "Mom, you're blowing this up," he said during the second call. "They're family now." "They're not my family," I replied. "And they're not staying." The line went quiet. Then he ended the call without saying goodbye. When the deadline passed the next morning, I stood in the doorway of the living room and told the Sterlings their time was up. Patricia didn't argue this time. She simply crossed her arms and said, "Do what you think you must." Gerald avoided my eyes. Chloe stomped upstairs dramatically, making sure every step echoed through the house. I dialed the sheriff. The deputy arrived 20 minutes later, a tall man with calm eyes and a voice that didn't rise above a steady hum. He asked to see my ID and deed, then requested theirs. Patricia tried to charm him, explaining that this was a miscommunication within the family. He didn't waver. "Ma'am, he said to her. "You were informed you don't have permission to stay here. You need to gather your belongings and leave." The house fell utterly silent. Chloe clattered down the stairs, furious. Gerald struggled to his feet, clutching the quilt. Patricia packed slowly, every movement stiff with indignation. I stood on the porch as they carried their bags to the SUV, the deputy standing beside me like a sentinel. When they finally drove away, dust rising behind their tires, the quiet that settled over the farmhouse was different. It wasn't peace. Not yet. It was the ache that comes after a wound has been cleaned, raw, exposed, but finally able to heal. After the Sterlings left, the house felt hollow in a way I hadn't expected. Their noise had filled every corner, but when silence returned, it didn't settle warmly the way it used to. It lingered like a reminder of how easily my world could have been rewritten without my consent. I spent the next morning moving slowly through each room, touching the backs of chairs, smoothing the blankets they had used, airing out the rooms until the scent of chamomile and unfamiliar perfume finally disappeared. I wasn't restoring the house. I was reclaiming it. A day later, Joan, my neighbor from down the road, stopped by with a casserole and a quiet understanding in her eyes. She didn't ask for details. She simply sat with me on the porch while the sun dipped behind the fields. I told her everything, not the polished version a mother gives to protect her child, but the real one, shaped by years of sacrifice and the sting of being dismissed in front of strangers. She listened without judgment, without offering simple solutions, and when she finally spoke, her voice was soft. "Boundaries aren't walls, Maggie. They're doors only you get to open." Her words sank into me like warm water, soothing a bruise I hadn't realized stretched so deep. Over the next few weeks, I made changes I should have made long ago. I replaced every lock on the house. I installed cameras and motion lights and fixed the section of fence that had been leaning for years. I called Kaplan and asked him to help me update my will. Instead of leaving the farm to Daniel by default, I directed it to a small fund that would support older women in the county who were starting over after losses of their own. For medical decisions, I named Joan as my emergency contact. It wasn't meant to punish Daniel. It was simply the first choice I'd made in a long time that centered my own well-being. Life settled into a gentle rhythm again. I planted tomatoes, repaired a window screen, and returned to the farmer's market on Saturdays with baskets of apples and loaves of bread. People greeted me with the same warmth they always had, but something in me had shifted. I walked differently, held myself differently, no longer shrinking to fit the expectations of anyone who believed my life should be negotiable. 6 months passed before I saw Daniel again. It was a crisp autumn morning at the market, the sky a soft blue stretched thin above the stalls. I had just finished arranging jars of apple butter when I felt someone standing quietly at the edge of my table. When I looked up, my breath caught. He looked older, tired around the eyes, shoulders drawn in like a man carrying more weight than his frame was meant to hold. "Mom," he said, barely above a whisper. We stepped away from the crowd and sat on a bench near the parking lot. For a long moment, he couldn't speak. When the words finally came, they tumbled out as if he'd been holding them too tightly. "I messed up," he said. "I told myself I was helping everyone, but I wasn't listening to you. I thought you'd adjust, the way you always have. I'm sorry for assuming your life was something I could rearrange." There was pain in his voice, the kind that doesn't ask to be forgiven quickly. I told him I loved him. That had never changed. But I also told him love wasn't a blank check, and motherhood wasn't a lifetime guarantee that my boundaries could be ignored. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Truth delivered gently can still be firm. He nodded slowly, accepting the terms of a relationship that would have to be rebuilt brick by brick. He hugged me before he left, a careful embrace that felt more like a promise than an apology. That evening, I stood on my porch watching the last streaks of sunlight fade across the fields. The farmhouse breathed quietly around me, steady and familiar. For the first time in years, I felt not only safe, but sovereign. I hadn't lost my son. I had simply reclaimed myself, and that was enough.